We're going to just kick things off. My name is Kelly Gentrup. I'm the Economic Development Specialist for Southeast Nebraska Development District. We have been hearing over and over again how tax increment financing is such a hot topic in not just our region, but across the state of Nebraska. And so we've been asked to host different events and different workshops and webinars. So we are here. We're excited that you guys are joining. This is the first event of 4. We are going to be doing 3 additional events virtually. Those are September 21st, September 28th, and October 5th. And those will cover different perspectives, and there's a different registration link for that. So if you haven't registered, you're more than welcome to do so. A little housekeeping before I kick it off to Joe. If you do have a question, Joe, if you feel comfortable, do you want this to be more interactive? And so feel free to raise your hand. You will need the microphone to ask the question, just so those who are attending virtually can hear the question as well. Those who are attending virtually, if you do have a question, please put that in the chat. And we do have a couple people monitoring, and your question will be answered, I promise. And then if you haven't gotten any drinks or lunch, there is lunch out there. Drinks are to the room to the left. So feel free to get up, get drinks. We're going to make this as informal and interactive as possible. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Joe Johnson. He is with Olson, and he's going to give us a general overview about tax increment financing. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly.
Nope, you don't need that.
Can everybody hear me? Can you guys hear me with this wireless mic on? No? Okay, we're going to try to turn it up. Okay. Is that good? Okay, sounds good. While he's doing that, I'll just talk loud. Sorry, people online blowing your speakers out right now. But so TIF is, I come about TIF in a different manner. So I'm not an attorney. Sometimes I play one on TV. I'm not an accountant, but I do manage the books at home. So if that gives me some right to call myself an accountant, then that's cool as well. But I'm a former city administrator. So I spent 15 years as a city administrator in different communities in the state of Nebraska. And actually, my mayor from David City is here, Skip Trowbridge. So Skip and I, we were brought some opportunities using tax increment financing in David City. And when you're fresh out of grad school and you think you can change the world and somebody's bringing in this TIF stuff and you're like, what the heck is all of this? How do I navigate this? How do I inform the city council of what's right, what's not right, and all of that stuff? Luckily, we had Mike Bacon, who is a great TIF attorney out in Greater Nebraska. And you'll hear from great TIF attorneys from Barrett Holmes. I think they're kind of last in the session. David Levy? Second. Yeah, so there's a bunch of great TIF attorneys in the state. But coming back to my story on TIF, I needed to figure out how this stuff worked. I mean, I needed to learn the ins and outs of TIF. So I started playing around with TIF on performas and things like that to help the city council understand what was coming before them. So my story with TIF happens very naturally and from a public administration kind of background. So that's what this presentation will kind of lead us down that path, a very natural TIF and how we use that and what that looks like from a programmatic standpoint. So what is TIF? So it's all of this stuff, right? No, just kidding. It's a method to capture ad valorem tax, which is you have a base tax and you have increases based on the development of the project. That's called the ad valorem tax. So you capture that. So no one's actually losing any tax revenue off of this. If it wasn't for TIF, this revenue wouldn't be there. There would be no increased property tax revenue or ad valorem tax on that. So, and you still pay your taxes. So there's a misconception out there that, oh, you're going to do a TIF project and somebody doesn't have to pay their taxes. Nope. They still pay it once or twice every year. It goes to the county assessor, and then that check, the ad valorem check, comes back to whoever's paying that debt on whatever that TIF project is. So there's still property tax being paid. It'll always be paid. And guess what? The county assessor still has control over what that assessment is. So at the end of the day, we can talk to the county assessor and have some of those conversations regarding what that valuation increase is going to be. But at the end of the day, the county assessor still controls all of that. So know that it's just increased taxes. It's not that base tax. Whatever the base tax, whatever you're currently paying today before the project, will still be paid in perpetuity, no matter if you did a TIF project or if you did not do a TIF project. So, and you still pay your taxes. So how does TIF work? So first, you need to declare something blight and substandard, a piece of property. So in metropolitan, primary, and first-class cities, that's 35% of your communities that you can declare blight and substandard. And I won't go into a lot of detail here, but just know the blight and substandard is, the magic is 40 years. So if something's older than 40 years, you capture the blight and the substandard. So 40 years, just remember that's kind of the magic number when it comes to blight and substandard. There's a lot of other stuff within there. So you declare a blight and substandard. So metropolitans, primary, and first class, 35%. Second class cities, 50%. Villages, you can completely 100% blight and substandard the whole community if you want. And that becomes important because there's been talk of bucket TIF. There's no such thing as a bucket TIF. You have to use TIF dollars within the redevelopment area or within the redevelopment agreement area, and you can't take that to another. So if you have a village, you can use it wherever in the village because the village is 100% blighted and substandard. But if you imagine a first-class city that has 35, which is 5% over here and 2% over here, you can't take a project over here and put funds over there. You got to use it within the same development area. So you declare it blight and substandard, and then that's done usually by a planning group. So there's numerous planning groups around the state that will do blight and substandard studies for you. So they usually do that and then come back to the city council for approval. So, and then based on the blight and substandard study, there's a general redevelopment plan. So that's usually a one-pager that's attached to the blight and substandard study that basically says that, yeah, it's blight and substandard, and you can generally, within this area, use tax increment financing to do these sort of projects, which is, I usually say it's a one-pager unless it's a very specific project at this point, because no, there's no real project at this point, even though most communities there is. But this is just very, very generic saying, hey, it can be used for public infrastructure, for example. So city approves that as well. Then the developer comes in and says, hey, I got a project over here that I would like to use some tax increment financing on. And this is the but-for test. So when you're hearing, legislators and local elected officials say, well, it doesn't meet the but-for test. This is the process. So the developer has to come in and say, but-for TIF, I'm not going to do this project. Or I can't do this project. That's the but-for test. But-for TIF, this project would never happen. So that's the developer saying that he or she needs something from tax increment financing to make this project happen. Whether that's true or not, we leave that to the developers to say yes it is or no it isn't. So then it goes through the CDA, CRA. So does everybody know the difference between the CDA and CRA? CRA is appointed, CDA is the city council, village board, that's the difference. So you can have either or. There's positives to both and negatives to both. Some communities like that separation, having a separate board, be kind of that figure. Some city councils like to have all that authority under one roof, so they make that decision around the table. So then CRA, CDA evaluates the needs. Then they draft a redevelopment plan. And I say this because it ultimately is the CRA or the CDA, but typically the developer pays for this. So the developer will pay attorney to do the redevelopment agreement, redevelopment plan that they're going to bring back before everybody. So that happens, cost benefit analysis, contracts, moves forward to the city. It goes to the planning commission. Now this is, I've been in far too many planning commissions regarding TIF that it's unnecessary conversation. So, and I'm assuming every village, every city, their planning commission is appointed volunteer board. And the last thing I want to do is appoint or have their appointed board, voluntary board, get blasted for a TIF project. Don't do that to them. So they have one mission and one goal for a TIF project, to make sure it matches the comprehensive plan or future land use map. That's it. That is the only question before the planning commission. Don't go into the specifics of the project. It's not where they're at. And you're going to put so much stress on the planning commission that is unneeded. And if you have a good chair of the planning commission, just say, we're not here to talk about the validity of this project. We're just here to ensure that it matches the comprehensive plan and the future land use. That's it. That's one question. Other than that, we don't care if Susie Joe has a problem with this project. If it matches that, say yes. If it doesn't, say no. That's it. So don't put your planning commission through that struggle. You see it time and time and again that this is another opportunity for people to come in and protest. Don't put your planning commission through that. It's not their problem. One problem only, matches the comprehensive future land use. Then it goes back to the CRA. So the CRA says, yep, okay, let's consider this. And then they make both of these, planning commission, CRA, CDA makes a recommendation to the city council. Then the city council holds a public hearing on all this information. So we've went through the blight, we went through the redevelopment agreement, we went through the Block 4 test, we've ensured that it matches the comprehensive future land use map. CDA says, yep, that's a good project, we want to pursue this. And then it all comes back to the city council for a public hearing. That's where people can come up, voice, do whatever they need to do to talk about this project. Those other steps, maybe in the CRA, because the CRA has some authority, CDA, CRA has some authority, you might want to have that conversation there. But this is the real true conversation point. This is the public hearing that's mandated by state statute. Then, if everything's good, it gets approved by the city council after the public hearing, then the pledges of tax increment financing, tax dollars are devoted to whatever the project is. And then it's implemented. So any questions on process? There's a lot more state statutes behind all of that. There's a lot more rules behind all of that. But those are the basic necessities of steps for that. Any questions on that? So this is what TIF looks like. So, and now there's a 20-year under extremely, I'll go into that a little later. But tax increment financing, there's always a value placed on the land. So every piece of parcel, every piece of land in the state has a value currently assigned to it. No matter what that value is, that value never changes. All the other taxing authorities and jurisdictions continue to have that tax base throughout the TIF project. The only difference is that we're going to do a project on top of this fixed tax. And then that will increase the valuation of the property. That's the ad valorem tax. That's the TIF. That TIF lasts for 15 or 20 years, and then it goes away, and then all the taxing entities get that increased valuation thereafter. So, and I hit on this point because everyone in this room has probably said, we're losing tax dollars. If you do this project, we will lose tax dollars. You cannot lose something you have never had. So the base, you're not losing the base. The base is always going to continue to be there. Always. You're not losing something you didn't have. The yellow portion is the tax increment financing. That's because we did a TIF project that increased the valuation, that went through the but-for test, and all of that stuff, all that process that we just went through to create that project. If we did none of that, you'd still have the base tax. You still have the base tax. So you can't lose something you don't have, and that's an important part. But I will tell you, for all the other taxing entities out there, this is a momentum changer. So I'll show you some examples, but this project goes on in perpetuity until it's no longer valid as a project. So you may lose, or you can't lose, but you may miss out on this tax base, but after 15 years, all those tax entities get that valuation increase. Yeah.
You made a statement that it can go up to 20 years. Everything that I have heard regarding TIF has been at 15
Yep.
years. So what is the difference between a project that can be TIFed for 15 years versus
Yep.
a project TIFed for 20 years?
Yeah, so I'll go into that. That was just a recent change in the legislation.
Jill, will you mind reading?
Yeah, so the question is, just up until recently, or right now, everybody's been hearing it's just 15 years. But the legislation has changed within the last 2 years that allow it to go up to 20 years on extremely blight. And I have a slide that covers that here coming up. It'd be difficult to blight an area based on those standards, though. Yeah.
Thank you.
My question is more of a response that you would give. The question that I was approached with is, in a developmental area that we are going to be looking at making it a TIF developmental area, they are looking at putting homes that weren't there before.
Yep.
The question that I was posed is, what kind of burden are we placing on our schools if we are bringing in multiple families with multiple children, and these children will need schooling?
Yeah.
What would be your response of positivity to that question?
Yeah, so it's a frequent conversation piece when we're talking about tax increment financing and schools taxing authority regarding that. So what I would say is that unless you're putting in 1,000 homes, I mean, the average household population, I believe, in Nebraska is like 2.56, somewhere in there. So if you have 2 parents and 1 child in that house, basically is what we're talking about. So if you're building 10 homes, you get 5 kids. If 5 kids is going to damage your school district that much, then there's other issues at play there. But I will say that most communities that have an active conversations with their school board and their school officials, they actually want more students because that's more TIOSA, that's more state aid, that's more students. So their student population's not dying. So I would say that it's probably, I mean, it's always the matter of not having that tax base, but the TIOSA formula makes up for that. I don't know the ins and outs of that. I'm not an accountant. But there's far more benefits of having students in the classroom than not having students in the classroom. And to be honest, most of those students are already in the public school system wherever you're at. No, we'd have to talk. So, but in most of the projects we've done, it's just moving up. So when we've done a housing, I'll show you a project example, but we're just allowing a recycling of the housing market in most communities. So most communities, they don't have an opportunity to move up a household to another level of house because there's nothing available. So what we've seen in markets that we've done housing TIF projects is they're just moving up, allowing another family, a younger family that may not have kids, to move into the community. So I think the real conversation piece with the school is just to be upfront and say, hey, we're building 1 house a year in XYZ community. It's not going to do the city or the school district any good to be building 1 house a year. How do we solve this? Because if we're going to make a dent and increase the population of the school district and the community, we need to be doing 30. Let's have a conversation around that. So, yeah. Great questions, by the way. So, what can TIF be used for? So anything public infrastructure, right? So anything that the public puts in. So buying property, the CRA, CDA can buy property. They have that ability, and they can use tax increment financing to do it. They can demo sites, install all the public infrastructure. Parking facilities, the cost of planning, design and engineering, and attorney fees. I don't have that on there. Cost incurred by the city, so financing, anything like that. So hiring an accountant, hiring an attorney, hiring whoever. That's a TIF expense. Rehabilitation of existing structures, and then just recently, within the last 7 years, workforce housing, which I'll dive into a little bit different because that's handled. And I have private costs next to that because that doesn't necessarily have to be public infrastructure. It's very difficult to do a workforce housing and kind of pay the developer, but we'll go through that. Formerly used defense sites, I think that's the Grand Island bill that happened probably 5 years ago. Grand Island and Hastings, I believe they were the two pushing that. So those are the basic things that TIF can be used for. So any public infrastructure would be appropriate use. So let's talk about some examples. So I'm going to give you, if we talk to state legislators, this is their example. Like this is what TIF is made for, is this example. So imagine a small community, any community, it doesn't have to be small. There was a thriving gas station back in the 50s and 60s. Everybody stopped there to get a pop and to fill up. Then, as time changed, maybe ownership changes, it becomes a small engine repair shop. And then they do business like that for 10 years. And then it becomes a used car lot where maybe they're selling some used cars. And then it becomes vacant. So now you have this vacant gas station on the main drag within your community that's just having things stored. So we're talking about 70 years of life of this building. And oh, by the way, there's gas tanks under there that may or may not be leaking. So what do? So the value of this, the base valuation. So going back to, remember the base? Going back to the base, this is what the current valuation of this building is, or was back then. $40,000. That's all the taxing entities got off of this building just because of the deterioration of this site. So what do? We tear that thing down and put this thing up. So we've taken out this blight and substandard, which by all accounts, it's blighted and it is definitely substandard. We tear it down and we put up this building. This building, so we have the base, that's the taxing, so that's the tax dollars that will go off of it. This building is now worth $500,000. So we've increased the valuation of this thing, $400,000. So what this does is this produces a year-to-date about $120,000 in tax increment financing. So what did we do with those funds? So this is a report. Here's the website. If you haven't been and looked at TIF projects, you can look up any TIF project in the state of Nebraska. But if you go to the Revenue Department and they have an annual TIF report that's due to the legislature, it's right there. But this is Man on a Bike project in Nebraska City. What they did is they acquired the property. So they purchased the property. They did site preparation, which involved gas monitoring and gas extraction from the site based on the leaky tanks, improvements to parking, sidewalks, and all that stuff. So started in 2009, and it'll go till 15 years. I mean, the expenses of this property outweighed the TIF by a long shot, but this property has produced $120,000 in TIF. But going back to the but-for test, if we didn't have TIF to acquire this property and to do the remediation of those gas tanks on this property would be in worse condition than it is right now. So this is a prime example of a TIF project that the legislature, this is their mind. This is the project. This is the poster child for a TIF project. So, but If anybody's been to Nebraska City, this is right on the main drag there. It's a pretty prominent location. I don't think it's no longer Man on the Bike, is it? No. But it's a pretty prominent location. This is definitely an upgrade from what it was. So that's one example. So let's talk about housing. So housing is always a touchy TIF kind of project. So this is a housing project in South Sioux City. This has always been meant to be developed, this area. It wasn't platted. I'm showing a platted view of this property. Actually, a high school buddy of mine came and said, "Hey, Joe, I'm a builder. I need lots. Can you help me?" And I said, "Sure, we can help you." He said, "I just build houses. I'm not worried about the infrastructure. Or I don't want to worry about the infrastructure. I don't want to do anything like that. I just want lots to build homes." And I said, "Okay, cool. Let me go talk to Lance Hedquist," if anybody knows Lance Hedquist up in South Sioux City. So Lance and I had some very great kind of discussions on housing and using tax increment financing for housing. So this is an area that's not, if you're building a housing subdivision, it's probably not your first choice, but it's needed infill. So the railroad tracks, so this is cul-de-sacs here, railroad tracks are here, Missouri River's over on that side of the property. So not ideal for a housing subdivision, but you're not going to put anything else there, right? You're not going to go stick a commercial or an industrial site in between apartment complexes and homes. So the only use of it could be residential, but we needed some infrastructure in there. So what we did is we did this. We just stubbed it out, which is creating the case for the next phase of the project. Hovey Construction has started to build homes. So all of these homes, this is a picture from last summer. All of these homes are constructed. The only lot that's not developed is this one, and we're just using it to store dirt for future phases. So as they dig out basements, they put the dirt there. But this has only been going for 1 year. So base valuation, that's the taxes. Excess valuation, so there's 2 homes out there that are built in 20, that TIF was collected in 2021. So 2022, all the rest of these homes will be built. So in 2023, that tax revenue will roll in. And then that has 9,000. So not much. So the deal on this project is that the city of South Sioux City believed in the project and the infill here, that they were willing to foot the bill on that. So the CRA in South Sioux City said, "We'll take on the infrastructure costs." Infrastructure costs were like $380,000 to put all that in. They said, "We'll do that. We want TIF, but there's a gap here because we know that TIF, and by the time you build these homes, will not cover the debt." So TIF does cover debt of the public infrastructure. So they needed some gap financing in here. So this is what it looked like. So year 1, this is when we built the houses. So that was 21 and 22. So we got the TIF in 22. 10 homes were built last year. This year, we'll get the tax increment financing on those. Oh, sorry, you guys can't see that. Let me make it bigger. So year 1, year 2. So tax year, that's when they're built. Year of payment, that's when the TIF starts rolling in. So we built them last year, TIF rolled in this year. We're building them this year, and TIF will roll in next year. And then that last house there. So we have 13 lots there, and that's what it'll do. So going back to this slide, we had to do something creative. So what Andy Hovey Construction did is he said, "I'll give you $5,000 per lot. And that $5,000 comes back to the city once I sell the home and the lot. So once that transaction happens, I pay the city $5,000. So what has happened here is being creative with TIF and working with the city is that, so you see the assessment, that $5,000 helps cover the debt, that's the debt line here. In 2022, based on the homes, the TIF dollars will now cover the debt of this project and provide right here an extra $400,000 in TIF for the next phase of this project. So this is what we call in the housing is the phasing. So you have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 on this project, or phase 1 on this project, and sub-phase 1, sub-phase 2, sub-phase 3. Because with housing, you don't want to start the TIF right now and have 5 homes built and then 5 homes built, and then you just lost out on 2 years of tax increment financing. You want to do it in sub-phases so you capture the full 15 years of that project. So this is a project, residential project, but I'll go back to this slide, it's better to look at. So in small communities across the state, they often approach me and say, hey, Joe, we need 15 lots or whatever. Can you go find a developer and bring them to our community and they'll build 15 lots and build 15 homes? Not going to happen. It's just not. There's no developer on a white horse that's going to ride in and do that. Now, we can attract developers using incentives like tax increment financing to bring them to the communities. We've done it in the very smallest town. So the smallest housing TIF project was in Palmer that I've done. And Palmer, it has Sid Dinsdale and Dinsdale Auto and Pinnacle Bank, so there's money there. But it was a small community. We did 15 lots. That's all they needed. But you can do this model in those environments. Now, I will say, going back to your question earlier, in larger communities, Omaha, Sarpy County, Kearney, and there's others within the state, they just simply don't allow TIF to be used for residential purposes. And that's a local decision. That's the beauty about TIF, is that it's controlled locally. There's nothing saying you have to or you ought to. You control it locally. So any questions on that? So legislative changes. So micro TIF. This is a recent, 2020 is when this law passed. And it's an expedited review. So I know there's a lot of questions. There's not a lot of case study on micro TIFs at this point. There's just a couple of them that have happened in the state of Nebraska. But the goal of a micro TIF is to make it, to do away with all that process. So if we go back to the steps, all that process is taken care of. We go into the Planning Commission, go to the CDA, going back to the City Council, going to the CDA again. All that process is taken out of this. If you meet certain criteria, so single-family residential unit, this is all within a blight area. So if you don't have a blight, you can't use micro TIF. All within a blight area. So 350 has to be less than that on a single family. Multifamily 1.5. And then revitalization of a historic place is $10 million. So if you fall within those categories, you can use micro TIF, which for the housing, that should be pretty easy to fall within those categories. Everybody cool with that? And the city village has to approve all of this before micro TIF becomes a reality. But then micro TIF, the benefits of a micro TIF is it just goes to one person, whether that's the mayor, the city council, or the city administrator, the city clerk, whoever that designee is. If they meet all this requirement, they fill out the one pager and submit it, then it's approved. So one person can approve this TIF, not the whole planning commission, CRA, city council, all that stuff. Everybody good with that? Questions? So that's a recent change. I think we'll become more active in this with micro TIFs as we move forward. I think everybody's just trying to explore their way through at this point. And it really takes just an individual to do this that's not concerned beyond the project in front of them. So if I were if I was looking for a house, I'd look for blight and substandard areas to access this. I'd look for blight and substandard areas, find a house that has maybe $40,000, tear it down, build $300,000 home, and then I can collect TIF on that. If I were just doing these one-off kind of projects. So, yeah.
So is micro TIF still limited to 10 years?
Nope, 15 years.
It's 15?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, the limit of micro TIF, it's 15 years. There was a question if it was just for 10. Workforce housing. So this is, so I mentioned before workforce housing. So and extremely blight. Let me address extremely blight. That was a law that was passed last year. So if you meet the requirements under extremely blight, and it's more to do with employment rates than anything. So really, it's just difficult to meet the extremely blight. The only project that I know of that met the extremely blight is the streetcar project in Omaha. They did an extremely blight area. That's because they can protect the interest of those around it because it's such a large, drawn-out project. But if you're trying to do an extremely blight in a small community, and you're trying to capture employment data and things like that, it'd simply be very difficult to do. So, so extremely blight, if you meet that threshold, then you can go up to 20 years instead of 15. That was a new law as of last year. Well, I take that back. The 20 was added last year. Extremely blight was added to the workforce housing when it was originally adopted back in 18. So,
Joe, we have a question
Yeah.
from the chat. I've heard that TIF is almost always on the chopping block by the Nebraska legislature during their session. Is that true?
there's always changes to TIF, yes. I don't know if it's always on the chopping block. There are some senators that are concerned with how TIF is used locally. There are some senators that are in full support of TIF being used however it can be used. So I think we run the spectrum on it, but it's always going to be looked at. It's always going to be, there's always going to be changes made to TIF. I don't ever perceive those things stopping because TIF is the only locally controlled incentive ever. That's it. There's no other locally controlled incentive that you don't have to go to the state or the federal government to use. TIF is completely controlled by the local governing board. And I think that's why it's always going to be brought up, because just like every human being, cities are different. And some cities take an ultra-conservative stance when it comes to TIF. Some cities use TIF like it's water. And I'm okay with both of those spectrums there because it's locally controlled. That's a local decision made by locally elected officials. And I think that's where TIF. So I think the issue from my standpoint is if that control was ever to be taken away, then that would bring up big overarching issues with the use of tax increment financing. So in other states like Kansas, there's two kinds of TIFs. There's a locally controlled TIF and then there's a state controlled TIF. So we might see something like that where it'd go, but in Kansas, you can go up to, I believe, 25 years on a certain TIF and 20 years on a regular TIF. So, yep. So workforce housing. Remember in the first slide that I said workforce housing doesn't have to be public infrastructure. So what this is right now, and I put this in, it's a lot of stuff because I've been hearing in the last 6 months that is workforce housing 350 or 325 or is it 275? Like where is that at? So there are legislations that have the exact same verbiage. Under the TIF statute, workforce housing is still 275. But within that statute, it does say that the Department of Economic Development controls that, so they can bump it up based on the consumer price index. I don't know, and I haven't asked Dan Kern or Tony Goins if they have, but I haven't seen any communication from the Department of Economic Development saying they've bumped the TIF statute definition up to 325. Where that comes in is the rural workforce housing investment. They've bumped that up. They're the exact same except for the amounts. So I think people are getting confused out there if they say, well, we can go up to 325, not using TIF. if you go through the Rural Workforce Housing Incentive Act, yes, not through TIF. So I put that in there, and there's rental units in there as well. To use workforce housing, you need a housing study within 24 months. Can't be greater than 24 months old. So you have to update your housing study if you want to use this. But workforce housing hasn't been widely used. So workforce housing is a cash. So the developer gets cash for building the house. That's it. So the TIF isn't going to be used for infrastructure. It may be used for infrastructure. They're just building that cost into that house price. But the housing developer just gets straight cash. Usually that translates into about 30% of the value of the home comes back in straight cash to the developer over the 15 years. But the reason this isn't widely used is that most housing projects need infrastructure. So if I were a developer, the cash is irrelevant, whether it comes to me on the backside based on the housing value or if it comes to me after I put in the infrastructure. It's much easier to put in the infrastructure, avoid the housing study and all the hoops that go along with the workforce housing, and just go that route, because the cash is the same on both of them, if you look at it. Now I can see if you were doing a residential subdivision of 1,000 homes, kind of like a celebrity homes model, this may make a lot of sense because you're just coming in, plowing in the infrastructure, putting all that in, and then you're just simply building that into the house of the price of the house, and then you're selling houses like 100 a year, and then you're just getting that straight cash at 275, at 100 pace a year. That's the only sense that this would make. If we wanted to try to do a 10-lot subdivision in a smaller community, it just wouldn't pan out. You'd make more sense doing public infrastructure than workforce housing.
We have another question
Yeah.
in the chat. In establishing a blighted area, homeowners that are within the purposed area argue that being in a blighted area devalues their property. How do you respond to that issue?
Yeah, so I can't change the perception of that. All I can tell you is that what I've seen is in blighted areas, housing values actually increase. And I hate to say that out loud because the next argument is going to be, you increased my property tax because you blighted this area. Because that's normally what we see. Because it's a redevelopment tool. So housing or parcels of land within a blighted area now become more valuable because they can use the tax increment financing tool. I've never seen it go the other way. I've never seen it go where there's been a blight of anything and the valuations plummet. It's been the exact opposite. I think I hate the term blight and substandard. If we can come up with other names for declaring areas, but in the state of Nebraska, it's a redevelopment tool, not a development tool. So you have to redevelopment something and you need a mechanism to say, this needs to be redeveloped. And the blight and substandard study is just that mechanism to say this needs to be redeveloped. So I don't like the terms, I agree, but I've never seen it go the opposite way. I've always seen valuations increase after blight and substandard studies. Good question. Any questions on this? These things are new laws, and we'll see how they get deployed on the ground moving forward. Yeah.
Look,
Is the micro-tip part the fund for? Is that also a requirement?
Nope. So it's all taken care of. If you meet these things, you're
Joe, will
good.
you repeat that question?
Yeah. So the micro TIF is at the but-for test. So that's all taken care of. So it's all taken care of under the approval of the micro TIF. So you come in with a one-page application, and you're within this blighted area, and the city has gone through the process of doing a micro TIF in this area. You're good. You just need to meet these requirements. Yep.
We have another question
Yeah.
in the chat. Would you believe rural workforce housing be a good fit for condominium development in second-level downtown spaces?
Absolutely. Yep. So what we've seen, it's a great use. So what we've seen in downtowns is the second story, they put insulation on the floor and don't touch the top stories forever, which is just a waste of space, right? So housing is critical across the state. And if you have a vacant space that you can rehab into a housing unit for new families to come in or new individuals to come in a cool downtown space, we ought to be doing that. Yep, for sure. That's a Joe Johnson kind of like stance on it, but benefits of TIF. So it provides an incentive for redevelopment of blight areas. So obviously if we went through the hassle of declaring something blight and substandard, we know that something in the area needs to change. So it's a redevelopment incentive for that. Requires no tax increase. So city council is not going to come or any other taxing entity and say, we're going to raise your taxes by 4%. It increases property values, so this goes back to that question. I've never seen it decrease property values. I've only seen it increase property values. Creates a stronger tax base. So imagine that gas station sitting there for the next 50 years. That's not doing anything to create a stronger tax base. So buildings and improvements we put on that land create that stronger tax base. This is the big one. It's locally controlled. You don't have any state agency telling you can't or can't do it. Now, somebody may challenge it legally, but that's the only course of action. It's the only locally controlled incentive that cities have, and we need to hold on to that forever. Incremental revenue increases. So this is not, I mean, you can see it. So we've all seen the ethanol boom and ag manufacturing booms. So that can have a huge impact on one of those facilities. But what we've seen is that these are very incremental. So in David City, we did a Runza downtown. Very small but beneficial project. Doesn't really do too much, but it's incremental changes that this has. And it has benefits to other taxing authority or other taxing jurisdictions. Increased populations of school, which maybe is a negative. For most school districts that we work with, anything to increase their student population is a good thing. So that's it. That's what I got. I got 5 minutes. That's my contact information. You can reach out to me anytime if you got further questions. I do present usually with either the city attorney, or if they don't have a TIF attorney, then I'll bring one in with me. But we do present to city council, EDCs, counties, whatever. We do presentations to them as well. So, and sometimes those intimate sessions are nice because then you get specific questions regarding whatever's going on in that community. So happy to help you with that as well. Anything else? If not, thank you. I appreciate you guys' time, and let me know. Yeah.
Yes. So what's the minimum threshold for a TIP project? I mean, is it, we get questions, $50,000, $100,000. What's the threshold?
There is no threshold by state statute. It just depends what the city council, how much do you want to, how much of the hoops you want to go through to have a benefit. I mean, if you're gonna jump through all these hoops and hurdles, a redevelopment agreement using an attorney is somewhere in the $10,000 to $20,000 range. So if you're going to pay $10,000 to $20,000 in legal fees to get a redevelopment agreement put together, your TIF project probably needs to be more than that just to pay the bill. I mean, so there's no minimum. I think micro TIF will help us clarify minimums because all that stuff is taken care of, and you don't need an attorney to come in and do a micro TIF project. So we'll see what the minimum is, but state statute, there's no minimum. Great question. Yeah, Skip.
What does it take in any community to do a micro TIF project? does the city council have to accept the concept, or how does that work?
Yep, so you have to.
Do you want to repeat the question, Joe?
so
Sorry.
what does it take to do a micro TIF in a community? So it needs to be blight and substandard, and whether that's already been done or whether the city council wants to take that on themselves. Again, that's a cost. They range anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000, somewhere in that ballpark, to get those done. And then the city council has to adopt certain rules and regulations for that. That takes care of all the but-fors, that takes care of all of that, and says, yep, here's it is. And most of that is just simply saying, who is the designee, what form are you using, and then you got to get those approved by the state, and then it's done. So then you're ready to use micro TIF. It's not that difficult. All the TIF attorneys in the state are kind of cutting their teeth on this right now, and it'll become standardized within the next 4 or 5 years. So, but yeah, I mean, I just, if a community is interested in doing micro TIFs, it's a process to get us there, but we can recommend some great attorneys that can do so.
We have another question in the chat, and it's something that you and I talked about beforehand. Can you explain the bucket TIF?
Yeah, so there's no bucket TIF. There's no bucket TIF. And I say that pretty adamantly because that has been brought onto the floor of the legislature. And when we're doing things as a communities, bucket TIF, where you're taking TIF dollars produced in one blighted and substandard area and one redevelopment area and moving them to a complete opposite that's completely detached, has no connection with those, then that's what's going to get us in trouble. Now, it is locally controlled. I get it. If you can find a TIF attorney that they'll allow you to do it, I would trust them. But I don't like the word bucket TIF. So if you're in a village, you can blight 100% of your community. That's all within one blighted area. You can use those tax dollars wherever within that community. If you're in a first class or a second class city that can do 50%, imagine if you had 10% of the community blighted over here and 5% blighted over here, and you're taking from this and moving it to that. There's going to be real issues with that, because how does that benefit the redevelopment and the but-for there? So I try to stay within the rules. Now, I will say that you can do TIF projects outside a blighted and substandard area if it has an impact on that project. So I'll give you an example. I'm going to build this production facility over here, but I need to get water, wastewater from over there. I can pay for that water, wastewater line all to the treatment plants and bring them back because it's directly related to this project over here. So you can do projects outside of that. You just can't, you just can't completely separate them. They have to be connected in some way, shape, or form. Yeah.
But through that process that you were just referring to, whatever that property is,
No.
the blighted substandard area?
So
Joe, do you want to repeat
yeah.
that?
So do you have to do a skip annexation or a flagpole annexation? No. So to do a project, it needs to be blighted and substandard and needs to be annexed within the city. So if a property are not those two things, you can't do a TIF project on that property. Now you can blight outside the community or outside the corporate limits of a community, and it doesn't count against your your percentage, but you'd have to annex that property to do that TIF project. There is a small example. There's a statute where you don't have to do that, and it relates back to an ag facility. And it was a law that probably won't ever be used again. It was an ethanol plant that allowed kind of a skip annexation or a skip TIF to do it. So, but we won't ever see those ever again. So, yeah, annexed and blighted to do a TIF project. Any other questions?
What is the typical time frame from start to finish?
If without a blight study, so like just fresh project, anywhere from 6 months to a year, depending on. There's just a lot of factors in there. So, blight and substandard takes some time. Redevelopment agreements take some time. running through the city processes, planning commission, public notices, on all that, planning commission, CRA, city council. It just all takes time. So if the city can expedite some of those processes, you can probably get it done in about 6 months. If not, it probably takes about a year to get through all those processes. Great question. Anything else? If not, feel free to email me, call me if you have some some questions that you want me to address offline. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe.
Thank you.
And if your communities, I know we have some clerks and administrators who brought some of their village board members and city council, but if this is something that you want to have a individual presentation, Joe, I think you are more than willing to come to your communities to have this conversation and continue the conversation as well. I do have sheets of papers on the table. Those are surveys. Just want to know how we did. And then also kind of want to hear from you if you are attending the next 3 events, what you'd like to hear about. There's a lot of things that, Joe, probably didn't cover, which is okay. This was the general overview. So if there is something that you wanted to learn about more specifically, please let us know. And then also, is there a topic that you would like to hear more about outside of TIFF that you would like to see Send host some sort of event for? We'd love to get your feedback on that. So I just want to thank you all for attending. Thank those that are attending virtually. And also thank you, Joe, for coming to speak. Thanks and have a great rest of your day.